Welcome back, everyone. We are so happy that you have either stayed with us throughout this time or have come back to join us for our second panel of the day, our faculty and researcher panel. If you missed us before, you just missed a dynamic community partner panel where they blew us away, talking very candidly and really giving us some best practices for thinking about how we should be engaging in the communities and with the communities as we conduct socially just community-based work. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Layla Rodriguez, a member of the TCP leadership team, who will be moderating our faculty panel. Dr. Rodriguez, it's on you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bates. Wow, that is a very interesting panel to follow. There were so many issues brought up, and I was taking notes, and I needed more than 5 minutes to organize them. But hopefully, I've captured most of what everybody said and came up with some important talking points. So I am Layla Rodriguez. I am associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. I am the newest member of the Cincinnati Project leadership team, although I have been involved with TCP in some capacity since its inception. And so what we are going to do in this session is I'm going to introduce the other panelists. And then, just like in the previous session, if you can just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your research and what it means to you from your perspective as a researcher to do socially just community engaged research. Then I'll go ahead and follow that as well. I'm the moderator and a panelist at the same time. And then I'll just bring up some questions or talking points that were raised in our earlier panel. And I think everybody here attended it as well, so you can add anything that you want. So can I go ahead and turn it to Dr. Stacy First Holloway? She's Associate Professor of Psychology.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to the panelists who started this session out this morning. Like Layla, I was blown away and have been left a little verklempt as to what to say today. So my name is Stacy Holloway. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology. I'm a little bit of a fish out of water at the symposium today. My core research is not in community-based research. I'm an organizational psychologist by training, but my relationship with the Cincinnati Project and my interests here relate to the teaching that I do as part of our Master's in Psychology program. I teach a core required course for all of our students in program evaluation and have partnered with the Cincinnati Project to partner with a number of different community organizations and nonprofits in the region who are looking for support in program evaluation efforts. Our students every year, we partner with 2 or 3 organizations who need program evaluation assistance, and our students are allowed to learn about program evaluation by doing program evaluation with those organizations. I've come to love this work. I think it is some of the most important work that I do as part of my faculty position. Not only does it provide us with an opportunity to help those organizations in our community who may not have the financial resources or the capacity amongst their staff to gather information that's important for them to show to funders if they want funding support, and to help their organizations to become even more successful than they are. That is meaningful and impactful work. It also is a tremendous opportunity for us to engage our students in the community so they are exposed to organizations and to topics and opportunities for learning that they might not otherwise have if we were to teach them program evaluation by sitting in a classroom. Our students, when they graduate, 9 out of 10 times tell us that these experiences are the most impactful for them. And our community partners are I think equally as thankful for some of the resources that we provide to them. So I've been taking copious notes this morning on things that we can be doing better, and I look forward to the panel questions and appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Next up is Dr. Carolette Norwood. She is Associate Professor and Assistant Department Head in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies.
Hi, so thank you for inviting me today to be a part of this panel. I was so excited that we had a break because I needed to get on my elliptical for 5 minutes to work off some of the nervous excitement that I was feeling, bursting and yelling at the screen as different persons spoke about the importance of socially just research and finally taking us where we needed to go, which was a frank and honest discussion about the ways persons are oppressed, specifically pointing out the legacy of white supremacy and the impact that it has on minoritized persons' lives and well-being, which then makes nonprofits necessary, but moving us to a place of making them obsolete is what we should all be striving for. So thank you, Dr. Webb, for making that comment, and others who chimed in so beautifully. I'm a sociologist by training. This is how I often introduce myself, as a sociologist by training and a Black feminist by circumstance. So all my work to date has always centered the lived experiences of Black people, mostly Black women, but not exclusively, because all Black women are connected to Black men somehow. There are fathers, our brothers, our sons, our lovers, etc., our friends. But that said, my research in Cincinnati have primarily focused on reproductive and sexual health disparities and injustice, which is a different way that I'm reframing my work recently as in the context of health justice or health injustice. Most recently, I did a project with OPEN, Ohio Policy Evaluation Network, where Dr. Meredith Smith, Shockley Smith, was one of the CAP members, community advisory members. And that study focused on reproductive justice, right, in Cincinnati. Should I give that statement now? I pull something together about social justice. What I wanted to say about social justice research was that as university scholars, we tend to live in silos. And some of this has already been raised. A lot of this has already been raised. So we often gather and share our knowledge, often in our own circles, right? And sometimes exclusively within our own professional circles. The problem is that these circles are small. They're often homogenous, and therefore we tend to find ourselves singing a chorus to a choir of our own making. So for me, socially just community-based research challenges us to move beyond these narrow boundaries. But in doing so, it is important to recognize that we academics are not the only experts, right, who have a voice or should have a voice in shaping the direction of what gets research, who gets research, how that research is done, and how it gets disseminated. Social just research, community-based research, is about finding and actively, deliberately seeking equity in what knowledge is gathered, what knowledge is validated, and how that knowledge gets shared. So I look forward to continuing this very, very dynamic conversation that started in the last hour.
Great, thank you. And I forgot to mention for anybody who is joining us now but was not at the earlier panel, that if you have any questions that come up, there is a link to a Google Doc in the chat and you can type your questions there. So we had a third panelist, Juliana Mazzia. Did you make it, Juliana? Are you here? Okay, unfortunately, she had an emergency this morning and she cannot be with us. So I'll just go ahead and talk a little bit more about my own work that I consider to be community engaged. There are a few things that I've done, but mainly I have worked specifically with the Su Casa Hispanic Center looking at the role of local institutions and organizations, family members, the larger community, et cetera, in the integration of unaccompanied, undocumented, underage migrants. And they tend to be a fairly invisible population for people who do not interact with them daily. But there have been almost 1,000 of these youth who have been resettled to Hamilton County just in the last 5 years. There's 1,000 probably 5 years before that. And so throughout this project, you know, I feel like there has been a lot of good, but certainly a lot of lessons, right? As a researcher, especially one of my generation, right? We're not trained to do this kind of work, right? And so I think that there is a bit of a learning curve. And when I first saw sort of the prompt, right, for this panel, my first instinct was to say, well, I imagine that a lot of us from the researcher side think, you know, I'm going into the community, right? I'm doing community engaged work, and so that takes care of the social justice component, right? And that's not true. Like, it's not enough, right? And so what's missing, right? And I think that there is, first of all, the why, right? As to like, why are we doing this? You know, we're doing this from a good place because we honestly think that this is sort of the correct way to try to reduce some of these, you know, pervasive inequities that we've been trained since students to understand. And I agree with, I believe it was Renee who said in the former panel that most researchers go into this work with good intentions, right? And they're well-meaning. But as the saying says, right, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so I think, you know, we need to think about the why, but we especially need to think about the how, right? I think the how is where that learning curve is and where a lot can be done to get it right, or unfortunately to improve, right? And so I think there's certain points, right? So certainly at the beginning, right? One thread that has been running throughout the morning, and one of the core values of TCP, right, is that the need or the request is initiated or set by the community partner, right, formally. And then there's, of course, questions about, does the community organization itself represent the entire community, right? Who decides that? And if they do or they do not, who else needs to be at the table? Now I'm scared of using that word. You know, I think that there has to be a lot of dialogue and rule setting and managing expectations, because we have different goals perhaps, and so we have to find a common goal for this work. We have different ways of doing work, right? We work with different timelines as, you know, nonprofits versus academic institutions versus, you know, people who are just living their lives in the community. I think there's a lot of thinking about the how you engage in the process throughout, right? Again, a lot of communication, a lot of transparency, and then also sort of the ending points, right? Or does it ever end, right? I feel like, you know, in my project, I did what I said I was going to do, and then I got requests from other community organizations or just community groups to talk to them about this, and I said, okay, well, that wasn't part of the plan, but of course I said yes. And I feel like with the pandemic, I've taken a bit of a hiatus from sort of the formal project, but I'm here, right? And I'm available to the community and what. And so I think, again, that's sort of my initial, you know, response to all of this, is that we really need to think about the how you do community engaged research, and how do you make it socially just in a way that satisfies everybody's definition of what that even means. Okay, so I wrote a bunch of questions that stemmed from the former panel. And I think one thing is that we can initiate by discussing is, in your own work, how do you ensure that it is the community that leads and decides on the work?
Yeah, I'll go first with that one. I know in the work that we do, you know, we send a consistent message while we're working with students that the end product, we're doing this for our community partners, and we have to be adaptable in managing those needs. So we start out with a syllabus that says this is our goal and this is where we want to get, toward the end of this semester or toward the end of the second semester. But at the end of the day, if our community partners, pivot and say there's something else that we need, or we're finding more value in something else that we've been doing, we adjust to that. We're fortunate in that regard that we're not sort of beholden to a specific output, or, Renee brought up the point that oftentimes when we do research, we're sort of thinking, how am I going to get this published? And we're fortunate to have the flexibility to redefine our outcomes and our products based upon what our community partners need. The message that we get and we try to convey to our students the entire time is that they are leading the project, not their instructors, and that we need to pay attention to what their needs are and what they're telling us and what we're hearing from them that's working for them.
I don't, my approach is not that I'm leading or that the community persons are leading, but that we're co-leading, that we're in a partnership. And in doing so, when I think about community partners, I am very mindful that communities are diverse. And so for me, it is about being as inclusive as possible. And that has to be a deliberate effort, because too often, again, people tend to associate themselves with people that have their viewpoint and their lived experience. And so for me, it's always how do we make sure as much diversity is represented in that space, so that even a minoritized persons within those minority communities are also represented and included. But I don't typically find myself in relationships with people where I'm leading or they are leading. I like to, just like my marriage, got to be a partnership. I'm not walking in front of you and you're not walking in front of me, but we are walking together on a path towards a mutual goal. And so, yeah, that would be my response to that question.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, specifically with this project that I have in mind, certainly the request came to TCP from the community organization. And we met and we kind of decided, this is what my contribution is, this is what their role is going to be. But then once we got there and started talking to people, well, they had a different goal. Like they wanted us to do something else. And so it was also kind of bringing that, right? Again, this is why I think we have to be careful with assuming that an organization also represents all the community, right? However, you place boundaries around that. And I think something else that was brought up in the former panel was this idea that people in communities might be wondering, why are we being studied again, right? Like, what is wrong with us that you keep coming here, or that you're sort of determining what is wrong with us? So how have you dealt with that in your own work, right? How do you, from the researcher side, talk to community members about why they are being researched?
So in my own work, I think that's a great question. And immediately I was reminded to, again, something Dr. Webb mentioned about the approach that researchers go in with into communities, often under the assumption of a deficit. And so, which then already kind of sets up how things will move and proceed in a way that sets the researcher in some sort of superior position, or known, a position where they know better than supposedly people in the community. I think, oh golly, I'm just losing my train of thought as I'm speaking. Layla, please remind me of the question. I'm sorry, I'm old.
How do you talk to the community about why they're being researched?
Right. So thank you. So that there is some sort of mutual agreement that there is a problem that needs to be addressed within the community makes it necessary for information to be gathered. But that, that would assume that both people, both parties recognize this is an issue, like if it's infant mortality, right? So this is something that there is mutual concern about and mutual interest and wanting to know and understand better how this issue is manifesting in the lived experiences of people in a specific area. For example, if there's a zip code where the numbers are extremely wild, maybe you want to go in and again in partnership and with a kind of mutual understanding that this is something that needs to be that there is collective interest in addressing. But the other part of, I guess, the conversation, and I tend to see things from the big macro view, is that oftentimes we already know some of the problems and this is just an exercise. But that gets into a whole nother conversation about the politics behind doing research, the funding behind doing research, et cetera, et cetera. So the short answer is, again, assuming that there is a mutual understanding that there's a problem that needs addressing and there is this interest, would be the way that I would approach it.
And with our approach, when we go in, we speak with program participants and stakeholders with the organizations that we're partnering with. It's always very important for us to make sure that we're sending a signal that their voice is important, and as participants or users of these programs, that who better to provide information on whether or not those programs and services and activities are working than the people who are supposed to be benefiting from those things. So all of those conversations start out making sure that we're giving voice and making sure that we're making them feel safe to provide not only sort of what's working with those programs and experiences, but also what are some of the opportunities that could make them more impactful. So being transparent about why they're there. To Carolette's point, one of our biggest challenges is not being able to compensate them for their time and sharing that information, and that's a huge opportunity that we're certainly facing, because we want to show them that we value the time that they're giving us. But certainly the importance of their voice and having them understand that voice is an important part of the process is paramount for us.
Yeah, and I think, in my experience too, this is sort of part of the research process, right? Is even figuring out what people need, right? And so I tend to approach it in a very sort of open way. Like, we're here to find out what you need from us, right? I'm not telling you what's wrong with you or your community. And I've encountered this in my work. One of the concerns that my partner organization had is that a lot of these teenagers were dropping out of high school because they had these, minimum wage jobs to attend. And they don't see, the teenagers don't see what the problem is, right? This is the reason why they came to the US. They're making money, at least more money than they were making back home. They have loans that they have to pay to the smuggler, right? They have lawyers that they have to pay. They have money that they have to send back home. And so that's not what's wrong. Like, that, this is not the reason why we're talking to them. Like, it can't be, because they don't see what the problem is, right? And so I think even starting from that point, and I think this is true of everybody involved, that we really need to listen to these people. In the case of my project, even when they're children, when they're minors, right? That let them tell you what they like and don't like about their lives and their communities, for sure.
Can I say something that is kind of bothering me in the back of my head? And, so when we think about research and researchers and the origins of that history, I think we have to be mindful that as researchers, to avoid this kind of colonial approach to communities, how do we engage communities that are already doing work to help advance those efforts to dismantle whatever those barriers are, those oppressions are that they are facing. I think too often, and this was raised in that last panel, you know, researchers go in thinking that they're the only experts in the room, and sometimes ignoring the work that is already being done on the ground by people in the community, who, like anybody else, might want help and partnerships to advance their efforts. But I think that's, you know, one of the things that's kind of like in the back of my head that just been nagging at me was this, you know, that as researchers, we have to be mindful that there is this tendency to approach communities from this kind of colonial place, whether that is extracting the knowledge, going in, dictating how something should be done, or we're doing this for you. That kind of way of thinking is also problematic, and something that we're all probably to some extent guilty of, some more than others, but just something that we need to have on our radar as we are, you know, doing this work and are preparing to do this work and are teaching our students how to do this work. It's just, yeah, just a point I think we should, you know, be cognizant of.
Thank you. So we have a question in here. When entering the room with that level of mindfulness, what actions do you take to be less abrasive?
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I'll yield. I just.
Okay, sure. Well, I think just to build off your point, Caroline, I think you raise an excellent point. And, you know, whenever we enter discussions and from the start, even when we decide to form partnerships, you know, and both parties have to make that decision whether or not it's going to be a good, to use Carolyn's, if it's going to be a good marriage or not, is making sure that we respect and acknowledge the expertise of our community partners, and to walk in humble with sort of what expertise we bring and background we bring, but also you know, the expertise and the knowledge and the experiences that the community partners do. I think this work is impossible to do well if we don't start from a place of humility and empathy and understanding. So I think that's what we try to do. You know, do we maybe sometimes make missteps and lead with our researcher hat or our professor hat? Probably more often than we should, but you know, great community partners can call us down on that and remind us that we are equal partners in the process.
Yes, absolutely. Humble ourselves. Listen. Listen. Just shut up and listen. Academics love to talk, and I'm one of them. I can gab. But yeah, just sit down and listen to what others have to say. You know, medical professionals have the same problem, right? They come into the room already assuming they know this, that, and the other. And this has been, you know, one of the problems historically and currently, and that they don't listen, that they're too busy, you know, walking with big feet into spaces, already the knower, without just humbling themselves, right? So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also there's that stage of being like self-reflective even before you go into this, right? That you really need to think about the things that Carolette brought up in terms of, you know, how do I view research, right? How do I view my position, my relationship with people, right? And if you know, if we have faculty in this panel who haven't done this kind of work and then they're curious about it, you know, I think that that's part of that learning curve, right? And I know that, you know, coming from the social sciences, right, this is something that is more common now, right, to have these sort of self-reflexivity, but it's not something that was done previously. And, you know, sometimes I think of even just the word, like, what do I want to call the people in the community, right? And so there's like the research subjects or the informants, right? And then there's people who are like, well, they're not, that's not a good term, right? What does using even a specific term to refer to them do to that relationship that you have, right? Are they, you know, if they're your equals, then they're your collaborators or your interlocutors. And I've also, you know, talked to researchers who said, well, you know, I don't have research subjects, I have friends. Well, are they really your friends? Like, you know, so really being very intentional about thinking about how you approach research, and also that it's not up to you to define that relationship, right? But that they are also going to want to relate or not relate to you in some way. Mm-hmm. There's a question in here following up on this about how we teach or we work with students to develop these sort of humbling, deep listening skills, right? I think, you know, it's something that we're still learning, and then how do we at the same time teach that to our students?
I've been very fortunate to have completed almost 100 in-depth interviews with Black women in Cincinnati. When I say in-depth, they're in-depth. And, you know, but the first time I did this kind of work, I you know, as a sociologist, I, you know, was trained mostly as a quantitative researcher. And I remember in my dissertation, because Creswell was at University of Cincinnati, who's well known for doing mixed methods. And so he was one of the persons on my advisory committee. And I did mixed methods in my work in Ghana. And it was bad. It was terrible. The questions were written not in a way to elicit any kind of deep discussion. But over the years, I've learned to shut up and listen and ask questions in a way that allow people to tell the story they want to tell, and probe them on things that they may not be aware that they're communicating at that moment, because they themselves haven't processed something that I'm hearing that connects to something I've read in the literature. And so, but that's a skill. That's a skill that, again, also links back to knowing how to humble yourself and knowing how to take a back seat and let other people be centered. In other words, decentering yourself so that other people can be centered. So yeah, I think, you know, my experience with doing qualitative work has helped me to become not only a better researcher, but a better person, and a patient person, because you are listening attentively, you should be, to what people are trying to communicate to you about their lives.
Yeah, I'll add a step, and I'll sort of step outside some of the program evaluation work. And again, I should just say ditto every time Carol says something. So I think there are a couple of things that we do to help develop some of those deep listening skills. Maybe not directly, but I think some of the work that we do with students lends itself to that. One is before we gather data and conduct interviews or focus groups or gather some kind of qualitative data, we talk about the perspective and putting ourselves in the shoes of whoever that is that we're going to be talking to, and understanding if we're going to be going in and asking about their participation in a program, you know, what is their relationship to the program? Are they a user? Are they someone who developed that program? What's at stake for them, so that it's that we go in understanding that those answers or their perspective is informed by their experiences, their level of participation, their investment in the program. Just really sort of making sure that we understand who we're talking to, so that we can put their perspectives in better context. And I think that often helps, because I think students can sometimes go into those discussions and focus groups or interviews sort of not thinking about who they're going to be meeting with, and sort of thinking I've got to do this interview to check a box off for a class, versus I'm going in there to establish a relationship and to really understand who this person is. The second thing that we do is after those focus groups or interviews take place, we gather as a group and then we debrief and we talk about what did we hear and what stood out for you and how did you interpret this comment, and trying to understand the perspectives that might be informing some of the comments that we heard. And again, I think that's really important because you know, as humans, you know, sometimes we don't often take that time to reflect on, you know, more than just what was said, but why was it said and what was informing those things and what sort of emotions and investments and needs and values or and histories are those comments based on. So those pre-discussions and those post-discussions allow us to sort of bookend those experiences so that we can really, you know, seek to understand. And that's the most important part of the work that we're doing, is to understand. And as you said, just to really listen versus, you know, having those discussions just to sort of check a box and to collect data per se. And taking the time to do that has been really, really important for the work that we do.
Yeah, I feel like I have one unfair advantage being an anthropology professor, and that's that, you know, our whole field is about teaching students to decenter their culture, right? Like, it's not the only one, it's equally valid to everybody else's. And so it's almost like taking it a step further and saying, okay, now decenter yourself, right, from this process. And that's hard because there's also sort of a bit of a balancing act, right? On the one hand, you know, I tell them, like, be reflexive about your biases and your worldview and what you're bringing to the table, but at the same time, take yourself out of there because you're not the most important person in this process, right? And then in terms of students, like, yeah, you know, I'm teaching a methods class now, and so yes, we practice interviewing, and similar to what Stacy said, right? We think about it beforehand and then afterwards, right? Somebody just interviewed you. How do you feel that they didn't quite understand what you were trying to say, right? And how do we work through that? But at the same time, you know, we have a broad diversity of students. And so I feel like for some of my students, I have to remind them, like, you're smart and you have something to bring to the table. And for other ones, I have to say, okay, you are actually too much on that end, and I need you to step back and be humble, right? And so it is a bit of a balancing act. I don't know that I have sort of the answer. But then similar to this, there's another question brought up by the group here about how do you build trust with the community as a researcher?
So when I do research, I often don't know the persons that I'm interviewing beforehand. The trust building happens in the interview stage. And I have been effective, I think, at communicating that that when I'm listening to them, that I'm not judging them. And that gives them the space to say what they want, knowing that, you know, the data that's being collected, the information that's being collected is confidential, will maintain their privacy. And I am not judging them. I'm not holding them to a standard. It is just that I'm listening. So there is this Japanese expression about a white sheet of paper. And, you know, so my husband is Japanese. And so there was this expression, I remember him saying something about going in like a white sheet of paper and letting someone else tell the story, right? So the questions guide what it is that we're trying to understand as researchers, but in a way that allows them to write in the answer on this white sheet of paper, right? And as they're doing that, because a lot of times, at least in the work that I do, it's very, very personal. People have to feel like they trust the person that they're talking to, and that person is not, there to judge them or to think ill of them, but just to listen. And so that, that's what I bring when I go in. I maybe over time, if I when doing more research in the community, people might know. I don't know. I don't know how to go in and I guess as a researcher into a community and say you can trust me, other than in the process of doing the work that that trust is built, right? So you don't just trust anybody you don't know. There has to be some sort of interaction or communication with that person for them to figure out whether or not you are trustworthy. Yeah.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure I can add much value, but I did want to share a recent experience that I think maybe illustrates that process. So I do some work in the area of diversity and inclusion, and I'm currently working on an engagement with an organization that it's a school that's trying to diversify its student population, faculty population, and to create a more inclusive environment. And so as part of our discovery work, we're in the process of conducting interviews with our focus groups with various stakeholders within the school, including some of the students of color. So we had Zoom focus groups over the course of several weeks last month, and I led those focus groups with a couple of my students who were there to support and to take notes. And the focus group with the students of color, these are high school students, I think was the most interesting and powerful of the focus groups that we held. But the story, the experience that really stood out to me, and I think it gets right to this point of trying to establish trust, was that when we started the focus group, one of the participants, and again, high school girl, had a hoodie on, and she had the hoodie covering her entire face, and she could just see sort of her face through the hole in her hoodie. And we started the focus group as we usually do, promising confidentiality, telling them why we're there and what we're hoping to learn from them. We typically approach that by starting with some simple questions that are a little safe to answer. And so we asked about the positive experiences that they're having in class and tried to get them to open up a little bit. But this one girl was still very much in her hood and very physically sort of shut off. But as we started going, and I think, as Carolette said, you just have to be there and to show that you're interested in listening and affirming their responses and really trying to hear them. Over the course of that hour, that hood literally started to peel back, and she started to speak out more and more and more. So by the time that we were done with the session, we could see her entire face. She had sat up so that we could see all of her in her screen. And she was engaged in the process. After we were done, I invited those participants I gave them my email and my phone number. I said, let me know if you want to chat, if there's something else you want to share. And she sent a follow-up email and was very blunt and said, I came on and you're a white lady. Are you going to understand my experience? And she's like, I didn't know if I could trust you, but you were this and you were that, and eventually I felt comfortable, and thank you for making me feel comfortable. So I can't tell you that I know what I did or did anything intentionally, but I do know that whenever I approach those situations, I do come in humbly and try to be as respectful and open and honest in sharing my own experiences with them. And at least for this student, that seemed to work. But again, it was powerful for my students to watch this happen, to understand how important it is to establish that sense of trust in whatever way that you can. So no great advice there other than, again, humility, demonstrate that you're listening, forming responses, allowing them opportunities to build off what they're saying, starting out with maybe some easier questions for them to answer so that you can build their trust over time, and sharing some of your own experiences and some of your own flaws as well can be really, I think, really helpful for them to know that to sort of show that we're in it together.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat about how real trust, takes a lot of time and care, and that's kind of how I view it. I mean, I think that establishing trust in any relationship takes time, right? And that's no different for this kind of work. In my experience, yes, the time factor, and I think we're talking about two different things, right? Because like Carolette started talking about like in the interview process, right? And there's certainly like a level of trust that has to be established there. And then there's trust sort of in the longer picture or the bigger project. And I think obviously in an interview, you don't have the benefit of time, right? And so you both mentioned some things that you can do there. I know that when we're taught to interview, for example, the way that I design my interviews, like you leave the more sensitive questions towards the end, right? You don't open up with those. You give them time to relax and see that, as Carolette said, like you're not judging them when they answer a specific thing to a question. But I think in the bigger picture trust for me, it's also about just being honest and transparent about who you are, right? And I try to, if we have any shared identities, like I'll try to emphasize those. And so, I've interviewed people where moms talk about how difficult it is to mother. And like, I get it. I'm a mom, right? It's the hardest job on the planet. But at the same time, I'm not a Black mom. I'm not an undocumented mom, right? And so let's not be fake that I completely understand your experience of motherhood because it's going to differ from mine in these other ways, right? And I also think that you have to be ready to answer questions. I always tell, speaking of training students, right, that you shouldn't ask any questions that you are not willing to answer. And so people, especially when they relax with you, like they want to know about you too, right? This is not a one-way conversation. And so if I'm asking them questions about something, I better be ready to answer those questions. And I tend to be a pretty open person anyway. And so I'll answer whatever you want to know. And I think that helps for the people who want that or need that. And because we're talking specifically about community engaged research, right? I think a lot of times if we come with that, we're partnered with an organization in the community and people know that might give us at least an initial sort of veneer of trust if this is an organization that the community trusts. And I think having that benefit is sacred. And I think that's why this work is also something that should be done with a lot of care, because if you're careless, right, it might not just be like, well, my research didn't go well, but you don't want to affect the relationship that people in the community have with the organization that, you partnered with and that brought you into this process. There was a question also that was brought up in the earlier panel about, how do we move then from listening to empowering, right? So there was a lot of conversation earlier about, most of the time we already know what the problem is, right? And so we might not even need data collection on that, right? And oftentimes we even know what solutions work or have worked in other contexts, right? And so from the researcher perspective, right, how do we move from just listening, understanding to I have a role to play in empowering the community to just move forward with the action part?
I struggle with that question. Because I see empowerment as something that comes from within. And I don't know if I have a role to empower others other than to remind them of their value and their abilities to move things forward in the way that needs to be done. I don't see the communities that I have done work in as powerless. I already see their power. I see barriers in their way that might work to undermine their ability to push through, but I don't see them as powerless. And I don't see myself as some special person that has the ability to empower others. I see myself as working alongside to push back those barriers that are standing in our collective ways. It's not just their way, it's all of us that are impacted. They're not living apart from the rest of society. We all see and experience and are hurt by the same systems of oppression that are erected in those spaces. So I heard this over and again in the prior session, and I then was thinking, it was the same thing when I was doing my work in Ghana. It was on women's empowerment. How do we empower them? Again, for me, it comes from maybe a kind of colonial standpoint, a position where, you know, this other thing is coming in from the outside to bring other people freedom. I think it was Tia that wrote in decolonize, what does it say, decolonize research. Well, decolonization wasn't something the colonials did for the people in those territories. It was the people in those territories that stood up. And if you know anything about Black people and Black people's history, we have always stood up. That has always been who we are and what we do. And so we're not waiting for someone else to come in and free us. We actively work towards that ourselves. So I don't know if that's an answer to the question, other than I don't know if I can answer that question, because I don't see myself as having those powers. I can work with, I can walk alongside, but yeah.
Yeah, I think you maybe articulated why I was struggling to answer it well. And again, in coming back to some of the work that we do with program evaluation, you know, those partners come to us needing help on developing some tools, but once those tools are developed, they don't need us anymore. So it's working with them to outline a process, and working with them to develop tools, and working with them to gather some of the initial data. But beyond that, the community partners don't need us. You know, they're the ones that have not just the power themselves, but the knowledge and the expertise to implement those tools, and to continue to grow their programs the way they know how to do. So at least with that work that we do, I don't want to say it's not in our role, but I think that's just not something that community partners look to us to do, because they already are in those positions already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I struggle with this also, and Caroline, you know, I hear your point about specifically that word empowering, and there were several issues brought up or questions asked in the previous panel that get at this topic, not just through the word empowering, but for example, like what is our role in translating research into impact, right? Or so something about just moving from just understanding and listening to action in some sense, right? And I struggle with this because on the one hand, I agree with you know, what Tia wrote in the chat here, that you know, people and communities, and you know, they're already empowered. Like people know how to lead their lives. People know what they need, right? They just need other people and policies and systems to move out of the way. And so a lot of, you know, I wholeheartedly agree with this. I think a lot of how I saw my work in this project, or how I see my work in this project with the unaccompanied youth, is really understanding, right? You know, if only the school board would adopt this policy, it would make all these students and teachers' lives easier, right? Who are trying to help them learn English and whatnot. And so seeing my action sort of, I'm the person that's going to go and speak to them, right? To the school board, not to the community and tell them what they need, but to tell the school board, you're not listening to the community, get out of their way in this way or that way. But on the other hand, I also feel like there is, and this is very dependent on the individual people or organizations or researchers even who are involved in a specific project, but that there is this desire to say, like, you know, get out there and be loud. And I've worked with populations that they don't want that kind of visibility. Like they don't want to go and give testimony in Congress to try to change, you know, federal immigration policy, although that would be the big policy change that, you know, needs to happen for their lives to be easier. But then they might see their contributions as, you know what, I just want to understand as an undocumented minor, what are my rights, and to make sure that everybody in my community knows my rights, right? Some basic things about housing, right? Or, you know, what a police officer can or cannot do when they stop you at a traffic light or whatever. And so, yeah, I don't know that I also have come to sort of a conclusion about how I feel about this. Yeah. And, you know, sort of very closely related to that question then, you know, since we're on this topic of that continuum between listening and action, how do you conceptualize research versus activism? Like, do you see those two things as being goals that have to happen simultaneously? Do you see them as being separate things, as being part of a continuum? Like, how do you think about this issue more broadly in your work?
I will go, and I think that question gets to the heart of maybe a question that I had, or just sort of a comment that I wanted to get out. And Renee had brought up in the earlier session, she had made the point that, that the way the system is set up is not to sort of encourage those two things to be more connected than they are. You know, I know, at least in our department, we struggle a lot with sort of traditional markers of success and impact as academics and scholars, and thinking in terms of things like publications. But boy, wouldn't it be a better world if impact was measured in terms of how we're helping or contributing to communities and reducing inequities and making a difference and helping make a difference you know, in the communities in which we live. There are a number of models at the university, some faculty even in our department who are tremendous models of that, where their research and activism are very closely aligned. And I think that those are, I think, models that folks like me look up to, knowing that we want our work to make a difference. But I think too often the system is set up to keep research and activism as separate entities when they should not be.
So did I say I was a Black feminist? I'm just reminding myself and others of that. And the reason I do is because Black feminism has always been a combination of activism and scholarly pursuits. They don't, they have always intersected. Those two things have always come together. I think sometimes when people think of activists, they have a single image in mind, which is the person walking in the street picketing. I've done that. I'm now 50, so I'm in a different phase. I don't mind still doing that kind of activism, but there are other ways that people engage in activism. It could be the person that's preparing the food, as Dr. Luna just reminded me of. Zakia Luna did a talk last week in my class on her new book on reproductive justice and human rights. So the ways that people engage in activism can vary, right? It could be the person that's providing food to the persons out there on the picket lines. It could be the one providing childcare. It could be someone donating time. And I do that through my work at the Peasley Center. Time or resources, right? In ways that can help us advance community goals, right? So for me, those things I can't do one without the other, and both are essential for moving the needle, right? So yeah, that's my answer. In the tradition of the Black women before me, this is something we've always done. This is something that is necessary to make sure that progress happens.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I agree with all that. I mean, in the previous session, somebody typed in the chat about how we have to, you know, sort of, I don't remember the specific words used, but that we have to be like committed and we have to be bold and not be scared to, you know, be called a socialist or, you know, something because of this work. And I laughed when I read that comment because, you know, I was born in Central America, and my whole childhood was marked by, you know, not my home country, but 3 of our neighbors being in the middle of civil wars. And, you know, my parents were both, you know, members of the Communist Party. And I went to college in Latin America, where social scientists are so far to the left that we have specific groups for specific types of communism, and I've picketed and whatnot, and I'm still not comfortable with that type of activism. Like, I just don't think I give the best speeches. I don't want to be the one in the front of the line, holding the megaphone, right? And so this is something that I've thought a lot about. And to me, the answer is, well, the activism piece just comes from when you're contributing to affecting that change, right? In whatever way that looks like. And I'm not going to repeat everything that Dr. Norwood just said. Unfortunately, I didn't get to all the questions, but I have been reminded that we are out of time. So I just want to thank, you know, the other 2 panelists. Thank you for your answers and the conversation. And thank you for everyone who has attended this panel.
Thank you so much, panel. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez, for leading us in that panel. We really appreciate you all hanging in there with us. As Dr. Gaynor said at the beginning of this, we understand that folks are zoomed out, but we also understand how deeply important this work is. And again, it's evidenced by you all hanging out with us virtually for this half day. We have a video presentation that is going to play, and then we'll have our final keynote speaker, which will be followed by question and answer. Thank you so much for reminding me. Please give our panelists a round of applause virtually. Thank you. This is what community is about. Folks reminding us to do those important housekeeping things. And as I did last time, since my mic is on and my video is on, I'll be the clapper for this session. Thank you.